This is Comic Geek Speak, episode 1628, Top 5 Underappreciated Creators.
You got it on Wednesday, and you was like about it, going to the volume up. These guys will talk about it, everything that geeks love. From case of laser beams, opinions like the seasons on everything you read. And comics, movies, games, toys, artists, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek Speak, Comic Geek. Uniting the world's mightiest heroes. This is...
I'm Adam Murdo.
I'm Ian Levenstein.
And I'm Chris Everly.
Comic Geek Speak.
Woo!
Ow!
That is some jolly good chair dancing, sir.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Oh, I'm just so sorry that I have to sit in the big boy producer chair for this episode. I could not see a minute of it. Not a hip shake, not a Watusi gesture. You guys don't know what you're listening at home, don't know what you're missing. Not being able to see what Chris does during the theme song.
Considering how painfully white and arrhythmic I am, my friend, they're missing very little, but it's fun.
Now, white men can't jump, not white men can't dance.
Especially chair dance.
Indeed. Let's welcome our guest host today, shall we?
Hosanna, Hosanna.
Hello.
Yes, it is our good friend Ian Levenstein of the Comic Timing Podcast. Say hello, Ian.
Hello, Ian.
Perfect. Didn't miss a beat. And we owe Ian a great deal of thanks for being with us on this episode. Not only did he contribute this topic for this top 5 underappreciated creators, and not only have we been promising him to do it for over a year now, so we're finally making good on our word to him there, but he also supplied us with the WAV file of the theme song, which apparently has gone missing on our own computer. Once again, this is like the third or fourth time that's happened.
I aim to please, Murd. I am to please.
Yes, and you may save our bacon more times than that tonight because you're working with two Luddites here tonight, Chris. Ian.
Very true. Very true.
Chris and I don't know what we're doing, so we'll appreciate it if you can give us some tech pointers if necessary.
I'll give you the IT crowd. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Is it plugged in?
IT stands for information technology, doesn't it?
Yes, it do.
See, I'm with you that far. All right, so yes, we're going to do one of our ever-popular top 5 episodes tonight. Topic, as I said, contributed by Ian. Top 5 underappreciated creators, writers, artists, you name it, anybody who helps to make comics that we as geeks think deserves a little more props or credit than they generally receive. That will be our topic for this evening. But before we dive into that, let us give due to this episode's sponsor, which is Superhero Stuff, where you go to for all of your superhero stuff.
Not bad for remote. Not bad at all.
Perfect. Unison. Yes, it's superhero stuff at superherostuff.com. They're an online retailer of all kinds of superhero licensed apparel and toys and personal items, all sorts of goodies. And, of course, we are now into the month of November, so Christmas is coming. They're already getting some sales ramped up. If you go to their website right now, you'll find that there's up to 20% off hoodies and beanies. There's Boba Fett beanies, Flash beanies, Deadpool beanies. There's a special code sale right now, 10% off any purchase of $45 or more if you use the code NIGHT, that's KNIGHT 10. They've got a Marvel sale happening. Of course, they've got plenty of Doctor Strange swag happening. If you spend $65 or more, you get a free Doctor Strange pop figurine and 10% off the whole order. There's a special code you enter for that. That's Strange65. And, of course, there's always the usual assortment of superhero socks, superhero keychains, caps, hoodies, all kinds of stuff. And they've even got some superhero ugly Christmas sweaters available there. So now's the time to act on that if you want it for your holiday party. So, yes, it's superherostuff.com, our friends at the Superhero Stuff online retailer, where you go for all of your superhero
stuff.
Fantastic. All right. Now, I guess it's time now to get down to the business of counting down top 5 underappreciated creators.
Yeehaw.
Ian, I want to compliment you. I think this is a wonderful topic.
Well, thank you.
Amen.
It's always nice to take an opportunity to take it. Sorry, my son's being a pest. It's always nice to take the opportunity to acknowledge creators that we all know and love. We want more people to know and love. So, kudos, my friend. Kudos indeed.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what I liked about this topic is that it is absolutely a completely subjective and objective topic.
Of course.
But exactly what you said, bringing light to creators that we ourselves may love, but ones that we don't necessarily hear coming off the lips of every comic book lover out there on a regular basis.
Indeed. So, shall we dive in, gentlemen?
One more thing before we do, Chris.
Please.
I just wish to reiterate the standard disclaimer for this type of episode. These top 5 lists of ours are, as Ian said, completely subjective, and they're also kind of arbitrary, and they could be different from one week to the next. We were putting together these lists based on which entries or which creators we can think of off the top of our heads. A couple of weeks could go by, and we could have been reminded by one thing or another in our lives of other creators who are equally worthy to the ones that we put in our top 5 list. So please don't think us horribly remiss if we didn't mention some creator you thought we should have. We'll probably be beating ourselves up for exactly the same thing a couple of weeks down the line. So, yes, and we will, of course, have lists of alternates once we've gone through the ones that we have chosen arbitrarily for our top 5s.
Absolutely, yeah, and mine are in no particular order, by the way.
Always fun. All right. Who shall? So I guess we're beginning with number 5.
I think our guest should go first.
I completely agree. Ian?
Okay. Well, then I'm going to do Mr. Fabian Nicieza as my number 5.
Excellent.
Oh.
My number 5 is Shali Fish.
And my number 5 is Bill Mantlo.
Good one.
Thank you, sir.
So the reason I go with Fabian Nicieza is that I feel like he's the type of creator that regularly gets overlooked, mostly because a lot of his important stuff came out in that wonderful era known as the 1990s that Murd and I started off with. But
yes, we did.
Yep. But a lot of people, put their nose up at it as like, oh, that was all terrible stuff. I mean, all it was belts and pockets and foil covers and all that stuff.
Cybernetic eyes, grimaces.
Yep, you got it. But there were actually some creators who were putting out some very decent stuff for a while there, and I would certainly say Fabian Nicieza is one of them, mostly because he took the dreck, and pardon my opinion on that certain other creators put out there and made it work. Like hanging plot threads, for perfect example, or characters that were created just because of their look. He actually gave a personality and character backstory. Perfect examples being both Cable and Deadpool, who he had a lot to do with in building their character. Cable was just a throwaway, military guy until Fabian Nicieza went back and was like, we have this hanging plot thread of Christopher, Summers. Nathan Christopher Summers. Why don't we make him that? And it absolutely worked for the X-Men. And I mean, to this day, Cable is as big a character as he is, mostly because of the groundwork that Fabian Nicieza brought out there. Same with Deadpool. I mean, Deadpool, although he was, further fleshed out by other creators, his personality, his smarminess really came to light with Nicieza. For a while.
Ian, I got to stop for a minute. I'm shocked. I thought Rod Liefeld did everything with these characters. What are you talking about here? Come on.
Yeah, he might have drew everything but the feet, but he didn't create anything about the characters, and which is why I had to have Nicieza on that list there. And plus, there's other books as well. I mean, most of the Deadpool movie was work that Nicieza laid out in his Deadpool and his Cable and Deadpool runs with characters that were beloved. The guest appearance by Bob the Hydra Agent. He created Bob the Hydra Agent in his Cable and Deadpool run, and it's still one of my favorite, breaking the fourth wall characters who, joined Hydra just for the dental plan.
I'm remembering now, didn't he write The Wedding of Scott and Jean in X-Men 30?
I think that was him, actually. I'm not sure. It could have been him or Scott Lobdell.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember which one.
Yeah, those were the two big ex-presarios of that decade. It was one of the two.
Yeah, I want to say it was him. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I just remember that issue because it wasn't really a battle story, so there was a lot of character development in it and a lot of very nice, subtle interactions with different characters, reflecting on their history. I thought it was a very well-written issue. And like you said, Ian, there's so much dreck from that period, so much self-indulgence and just off-the-rails storytelling. And he's a writer, when I think about that period, he's a writer I recall fondly overall.
Definitely, and I'd be remiss not to bring up, since I know Murd is as big a fan of them as I am, he wrote the Thunderbolts for quite some time in the 2000s.
That's right.
And really built the characters past what Busiek set up, and wrote them for a lot longer than I think anybody even realizes. I mean, he was on that title for a very long time, at least 70 or 80 issues, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So.
Took it from Busiek's exit.
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Sorry, he took it from Busiek's exit all the way up to the the gap in their history when the title was repurposed to the Supervillain Fight Club thing that they did, and Nicieza was the one that guided it, righted the ship after that for about 3 years of stories after that. So yeah, and that Cable Deadpool run you mentioned, Ian, that's like 50 issues worth of Cable and Deadpool comics, and almost all of it was written by Nicieza. So
and the best part about that Cable Deadpool book is that after a while, Cable wasn't even in the book because he was killed off in the X titles. That it just became basically a Deadpool team up book, even though it still had the name Cable Deadpool in the top of the page. So go figure.
What is he doing now? Does anybody know?
I know he's done some scattered work here and there. I mean, I know he was doing a little bit of DC stuff, and I've seen his name show up occasionally with a Marvel issue here and there.
He did the Red Robin series with Marcus Toe on art. Pants and I were both pretty impressed with that series.
So was I, yeah. But very, very recent history, that would be a good question. I'm going to have to look that up on Comic Book DB to see what he's been doing lately. But yeah, I feel like he might be taking a well-deserved break from the mainstream books a little bit at this particular moment. But I hope to see his name back soon because pretty much everything that he does turns out to be very serviceable work.
Yep, knows how to use history, knows how to use humor. He's just a real solid writer.
Absolutely.
Oh, and speaking of Comic Book DB, guys, I checked out X-Men number 30. It was indeed Fab Nick who wrote that.
There you go.
Thank
Nice.
you, sir.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. He might have actually. There was a Deadpool. That's what it was. There was a Deadpool anniversary issue that came out somewhat recently that I know Nicieza did some work on. So I think that's the most recent thing I saw his name on. So he's still occasionally getting some Marvel work.
And I should introduce a caveat in case some listeners aren't aware. The reason why I got a little snide about Liefeld is that when the Deadpool film came out, there was an unfortunate New York Times interview where Liefeld, at least he's quoted as basically taking full responsibility for creating the character. And I that didn't sit well with me because, as we all know, the writer contributes so much to the voice, especially for a character like Deadpool when it's all about his voice.
Right.
And Nicieza and Christopher Priest and Joe Kelly all made significant contributions to the persona of Deadpool. So
even Mark Waid, because he wrote a miniseries or two.
Mm-hmm. The first one.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
So that just didn't sit well with me. So, all right.
Completely
Merge, Charlie
agree.
Fish.
excellent selection there, Ian.
Thank you.
And one of these days, Chris and I will get around to doing a Thunderbolt Spotlight, where we'll
Yes.
sing the praises of Mr. Nicieza even further at that point.
Yep.
All right. So I went with a creator who's he gets steady work and has been for years now, but he kind of flies under a lot of people's radars because he doesn't write the mainstream superhero books, but he writes things that are somewhat adjacent to them. He's been around for longer than I'd realized. I think I sort of dimly remembered seeing his name on an issue of the Ren and Stimpy show from Marvel back in the early 90s. Charlie Fish is a very distinctive name, so it kind of stuck with me. But apparently he was a Marvel staffer in the 90s. He wrote a bunch of issues of What the old Marvel humor book of the 90s. And eventually quietly phased over to DC, and he's been doing a lot of their licensed comics over the past decade or so. He's done Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, a bunch of different titles based on Cartoon Network series. He's also done some non-continuity younger reader superhero type titles. Like there was a Super Friends series that existed for a couple dozen issues a year or so ago. And he's doing the Scooby-Doo Team-Up series right now, which Shane and I really enjoy, which involves the Scooby Gang teaming up mostly with a bunch of other DC Universe characters, and occasionally they teaming up with other Hanna-Barbera characters. He's a writer who's shown a decent bit of versatility. He can write at pretty much any age level, but he seems to prefer just kind of hanging out, cooling his heels in the perceivedly lower echelons of kids series. But he takes pride in his work. This is clear. He doesn't feel a need to pursue like the mainstream stuff. He just wants to turn in quality work on characters he enjoys, it would appear. And so it's in that I think he's kind of like the Mark Evanier of his generation, because Evanier in his day he used to work for like Gold Key, and he would write all these like licensed cartoon character comics while his friends were like wrestling each other to be able to write the big superheroes. But no, Charlie Fish prefers to just contribute stories, fun stories to the licensed titles. And although he has proven that he also contributed backup stories to Action Comics under Grant Morrison in the early days of the New 52 when Grant Morrison was writing Action. So Morrison's a tough act to follow, but Fish's scripts, I think, in those few stories held their own just fine, frankly. He's got a very strong knowledge of DC history. And if you just look at some of the issues he's done of Scooby-Doo Team Up or of that Super Friends series I mentioned, he digs deep for obscure DC characters that fit a certain theme. Like he wants to tell a story involving cold, snow, or ice-themed characters. He'll throw out like Minister Blizzard from the Wonder Woman comics, written by Robert Kanigher. He did a story recently Peter and I were actually talking about where Scooby-Doo meets a bunch of famous DC Universe dogs, and he goes beyond just Crypto and Ace the Bat Hound. He goes to the Space Canine Patrol agents. He goes to Robbie the Robot Dog, like the Robot Man sidekick from the 50s. He's got really deep knowledge, and he clearly has a love for these weird, obscure characters and concepts, and he just throws them out. He's like a kid with finger paint the way he plays with them in these stories. But he finger paints Picassos with them, though, because the stories are really genuinely enjoyable. So even though he doesn't crank out the big marquee mainstream type title content, he generates very entertaining stories, and he's been doing it for a good 20-some years now. So I think he deserves a little more recognition, especially since his work is seeing print month to month to month, and relatively few people talk about it. So there you go. He's probably the most current and relevant of the people on my top 5 list, Charlie Fish.
Yeah,
I have to wonder. I'm sorry, Ian, go ahead.
I was just going to say I'd love to see what he would do with a Rebirth book. If he has that sort of humor going for him, like if he were to tackle one of the perhaps one of the more humorous DC characters that has yet to actually have a book in the New 52 or Rebirth, what that would be like.
Inferior.
But
5.
I was wondering. I'm sorry, Murr. Go ahead.
I said Inferior 5 Rebirth.
Murr, piggybacking on something you're saying before, because he's saying he hasn't done many of the so-called more upper, like top-tier titles in terms of publicity. I'm wondering if, in a way, he has more creative freedom because he's not tied into the endless cascade of tie-ins and crossovers. And I have to imagine that maybe in some ways it'd be more freeing as a creator to be involved in a book and kind of off in your own little world where, granted, they're licensed characters, but I would just imagine he can probably do a lot more with them. Because he's probably maybe doesn't have the same heavy editorial hand on him that I'm sure
of course not.
Other creators do.
Yeah, he probably has to deal more with the representatives of the licensing companies than he has to deal with editorial meddling. I think you're absolutely right there about the creative freedom, Chris. I can see that being important to him.
And at the same time, Chris, I mean, that can be as complicated as dealing with editorial at times, going with the licensees, as we all know from the 80s.
Oh, I can only imagine. All right, Bill Mantlo. Now, I've sung Bill Mantlo's praises on the show many times. Some might consider it, either ad infinitum or ad nauseum. And I don't consider Bill Mantlo a top tier writer per se. Like I don't hold him in the same. When I praise him, I'm not putting him on the same level as, say, a Brubaker, a Rucka, or the giants like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. But I've always admired his work since I was a kid. And he did a lot of writing in the 1970s and 80s because everything he wrote that I read, I always found thoroughly entertaining. And I was always in awe of his ability to take licensed properties and kind of weave them into gold. I mentioned before in this program, Rom, the Micronauts, both of which he's associated with. And with Rom especially, Rom was just a doll. It was just an oversized action figure with no backstory at all. He created a whole world for that, and the Micronauts wasn't much more than that. And he world built it for the Micronauts as well. And I still find both those series thoroughly entertaining. They're both integrated into the Marvel Universe in ways that I find very just clever and fun. And I know he was known as being a very fast writer, and he worked on a whole host of different Marvel characters and titles in the 70s and 80s. And again, do I consider him an A-list writer? Not really, but there's something to be said for being steady, and I think Ian maybe used the term, and I'll steal it here, serviceable, and someone who's reliable. Like I'm sure the editors found him reliable for his speed, and as a reader, I've always found him reliable. I know when I read a Bill Mantlo comic, okay, I may not be getting like the philosophical underpinnings of the universe from his stories, or like getting thrust into a magnificent tantric experience a la Alan Moore, but I am getting really fun, imaginative superhero stories, and especially with Raman the Micronauts, a man who poured his heart and soul and his vision into creating worlds for these characters. And tragically, he was terribly incapacitated in a he was hit by a car. I want to say he was rollerblading.
I think that's what I
believe,
heard too, Chris.
Yeah, and he was terribly incapacitated, and I think it's important for people to remember him as a writer. And he's also associated with the Guardians of the Galaxy and Rocket Raccoon and
absolutely, yeah,
and so forth. So very strong writer, a very dependable writer, and someone who rarely let me down from when I was a kid, right through the present day. And a lot of his stories you can find in relatively cheap bargain bins, or in trade, and I highly recommend them. The first 12 issues of the Micronauts or so with Michael Golden are fabulous. The art is beautiful. You really appreciate just the whole world he creates out of these little tiny toys that were produced in the late 1970s. And Ram is even more impressive because he just basically took this Space Knight doll that had nothing behind it and blew up a whole universe around that. And they still, Galador and all that, although I think they destroyed Galador in Infinity now, if I remember correctly. But
you do, yes.
Yes, but Marvel got a lot of traction out of that. And, I just think he's a writer that more people should check out, especially just fun superhero comics and fun cosmic stories. Bill Mantlo's your man. Yeah,
and you're right that people should be giving him a lot more credit than they already do. I mean, I think of the past couple of years, I've been seeing his name come up more and more and more, especially after that article came out about just the circumstances behind why he has deteriorated as much as he has over the years due to basically a failing in the healthcare program of the U.S. He basically fell through a loophole and kept going from better facility to worse facility, and unfortunately, that's just the way it happened for him. But I definitely would not have the current Guardians of the Galaxy without Bill Mantlo, and I was happy to see Marvel. For everybody that says negative things about Marvel, I was very happy to see Marvel give him a print of the Guardians of the Galaxy movie to watch in his room when it came out. And I saw the photo that they posted of the look of grin and joy on his face after watching it was just that just made me happy for an entire week afterwards, just thinking about that.
I remember hearing that story, and it's nice, especially in any corporate situation where oftentimes human beings seem to be the last concern. It's nice to see that type of gesture. And forgive me for asking, because I've lost track. Is he still alive?
He is, yes.
He is. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that because I hadn't read about it in a while. So
yeah, last I checked, he was still alive. And did he do some of the Marvel 2-in-1 stuff, if I remember correctly?
It's likely, Ian, because for a period of time, you could find his name on virtually every Marvel title at one time or another. Because from what I read, he had a reputation for working fast, and maybe that turned off some people in terms of his writing. But he was someone that, like a fireman, someone they'd plug in to meet deadlines, and I'd say late 70s into the 80s, he's all over the Marvel universe. I mean, his name is on a lot of credit boxes. So,
and those Marvel team-up titles tended to have a lot of different creators working on them at different times, just submitting a random one-issue story here or there. So yeah, I'd be surprised if he didn't write at least one or two stories for that title.
All right, Ian, why don't you call out your number 4?
All right, my number 4 is the Luna Brothers.
Ooh, double entry. Mine is Devin K. Grayson.
My number 4 is Sal Valuto. Ian, go ahead.
All right. So, yeah, it is a double entry because usually you wind up seeing both Jonathan and Joshua Luna's names on whatever titles they do. They're a brother team that has been working together for quite a while now. I first discovered them with their title Girls that they put out for Image. And it's an underlooked book, but it was getting rave praise when it first came out in 2005. And I think it went 24 issues, if I remember correctly. Sort of an under the dome type situation where one day this woman just lands on Earth entirely naked, and the man who finds her takes her in to try and nurse her back to health, and she winds up crawling into bed with him, and then they wind up having sex, and then afterwards, she then basically multiplies into all these other variants of the same woman. There's at least 12, 15, 20 of them running around the town. A giant sperm-like bubble envelops the town itself, and they're cut off entirely from the rest of civilization while this is going on. All while at the same time wondering if this original girl is to blame or whether this is something even more sinister than that. And I thoroughly enjoyed the series, and I really haven't seen their name much since then. They did a series Ultra also for Image Comics, which was going to be a TV show at one point. They even did a pilot that is sitting in a drawer somewhere that they never wound up producing. I think it might have been for Fox, if I remember correctly, but that didn't go off the ground. And they also did the artwork combined as a team for the Spider-Woman Origins series that came out for Marvel.
Sure, I remember that. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was a big fan of that at the time too, and really have not seen their name on too many books since. I think they're currently working separate a little bit. I think Jonathan might be doing some stuff separate from Joshua, but I'd love to see their names pop up again. And for anybody who hasn't checked out Girls and Ultra, and for that matter, even Spider-Man Origins, I'm pretty sure they're all in print, or you can at least find them on Comixology. And I definitely want to get their names out there to people.
Did they do a title called Sword?
Yes, that was them
okay.
too. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love their art style too. It's a very simple, not a lot of lines art style, but it really gets the point across, and they always manage to have so much emotion on each of their figures' faces, and that's one of the things that I appreciate most in an artist. So definitely check out the Lunas if you haven't.
I'm going to concur because I did read some of Ultra. I enjoyed it, and I could see why they would consider it for a TV show. Mm-hmm. But I want to echo your sentiment about the art. Their art has a very powerfully simple but expressive quality to it.
Yeah.
And I did not read Girls. I remember leafing through some of the stories and I mean this in a good way, taken aback by how jarring some of the plot development seemed in just what I was skimming through. I mean, it's a very disturbing book, and I mean that in a good way. There's clearly a lot going on in that story, that more than you might anticipate.
In the same ways that The Walking Dead ups itself issue by issue, Girls ups itself issue by issue if you keep reading it.
All right. Murd, go ahead with your number 4.
All right. Let's see. Oh, well, Devin K. Grayson. That's a name that should ring a bell with people who are reading comics in, say, late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, she's a writer who came to comics in a somewhat unusual way. She apparently, the way she tells it, didn't know or care much of anything about comic books until one day in the early 90s she happened to be watching an episode of Batman, the animated series. The classic Paul Dini, Bruce Timm one. And she just saw Batman and Robin sitting there conversing with one another like real people with real personalities. And it just sort of opened her eyes to what superhero comics really were, beyond just a bunch of costumes and punching and kicking. And so she just became obsessed with learning more about these characters, their world, their loves, their hates, their interactions with one another. And she eventually ended up just going to DC Comics and saying, look, I want to work near these comics. I'll just sweep up the floors and take out the garbage if you want, but I want to work for you in some capacity. And from there kind of climbed her way up into writing comic book stories. And for a while there, she was pretty successful at it, too. She She had a run on the Batman Gotham Knights series, which was a title that was introduced to replace Batman Shadow of the Bat, and it served about the same purpose that the aforementioned Shadow of the Bat used to. It was kind of like an anthology series of stories that were tangential to Batman and his world, focusing on people on whom the Shadow of the Bat was cast. And so she did a series of stories there. She did a run on Nightwing that was pretty well received. And my favorite work of hers was The Titans. Which was not to be confused with Teen Titans. It was a book that featured a mix of old and new Titans characters, just your classic founders. The Wally West was in there, Dick Grayson was in there, Donna Troy, and also a few newer characters, including like one or two that Dan Jurgens had used in his reboot Teen Titans, characters that were completely new and had nothing to do with any incarnation of the Titans before. They were brought into the fold as kind of like the newbies who were learning under the wing of the older Titans. So it was a faintly intergenerational take on the characters. It was pretty fresh for the time, as I recall. And Grayson always did impress me with her method of writing. She has kind of an organic, meticulously historicized method take on characterization, which is basically that she learns as much as she can about a character's history and backstory and just kind of allows a character's actions, thoughts, and feelings, reactions to a certain situation to play out of the character's history. Just puts whatever she knows about the character's past into play as she scripts the character's present and future. She was always very good about doing that, and it always impressed me. And she wrote good action as well, and she's kind of similar in style and in also the type of characters she wrote best to Gail Simone. A lot of the things that Gail Simone does well, Devin K. Grayson did quite well also, although she's not as well remembered for it. Although I will say that Gail Simone has a more twisted imagination than Ms. Grayson ever did. So, and Devin Grayson did fine at DC for a while, and I think she came over to Marvel and wrote like a Ghost Rider miniseries, a Black Widow miniseries or two, and then she kind of disappeared from comics after a while. I've heard almost nothing from her for a very long time. I think somewhat recently I saw her name as part of a dream team of all-female writers that Dynamite had recruited for some Vampirella project or other. But that's the first of her comics that I've seen, the first comic I've seen her associated with in a long time. And it's kind of a shame because that Titan series, and I'm 80% sure that Peter Rios would back me up on this if he were here to ask, that Titan series was quality. And it's an underrated run. And I think that the lady who brought it to us deserves to be classified as an underrated creator. She is one writer whose byline I still kind of occasionally hopefully look for in the previews solicitations. So I made her number 4 on my list.
Murd, I think she's one of those people that you could say is a victim to the comic book politics in some ways, too. Because I know that as the guys in charge at DC changed, that's when you stop seeing Devin Grayson's name on a lot of titles. And I know that
her contacts
at one
are no
point,
longer there. I got you.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that I think, if I remember correctly, at one point she was either married or engaged to Mark Waid.
They were definitely living together in Philadelphia. I remember that.
Right. And I still wonder to this day if perhaps that might be one of the reasons why we don't see her name anymore is because, obviously with a falling out like that, I don't know if people are always going to take her side and the quote-unquote divorce, as it were. But yeah, no, I always enjoyed her work. I read a lot of her Nightwing run and a bunch of her other DC stuff and, had a very good time with it. But you're right, her name has very much fallen off the comics radar the past couple of years.
And you mentioned that Black Widow miniseries. Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's the one that J.G. Jones penciled, where the blonde Black Widow is introduced, who's trying to unseat Natasha as the Black Widow. That's an excellent story. That's a very strong miniseries. I highly recommend that one, actually. So
and she co-wrote a Black Widow series with Greg Rucka. It says here on Comic Book DB. So I'm not sure.
I think that's the one I'm thinking of, actually.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. My number 4. This should be no surprise to longtime listeners because I'm bringing in the artist from the Christopher Priest Black Panther series. But Sal Velluto is what I consider a master artist in the comic book field, and I don't think he gets the attention and plaudits he deserves. Just recently, Hermes Press released the Peter David scripted miniseries adaptation of The Phantom, and Velluto did the art on that. It's now available in trade, so that's a more recent example of his work. This is someone who I just think is a master craftsman when it comes to his work. If you look at the Priest Black Panther issues 13 through 49, that's Sal Velluto working primarily with the inker Bob Almond, which I consider a dream team. And Sal Velluto's line work, his expressiveness, his attention to detail, the way he delineates combat scenes as well as quiet scenes between characters. When we did our Black Panther spotlight, I referred to a page where it's the T'Challa and Storm embracing, and it's a moment of fragility for T'Challa, and there's no dialogue, but the power of that page, as just through his art, you really understand the connection, the intimacy between them. And at the end, T'Challa admits to Storm that he is afraid, that he's a man, essentially. It's the most beautiful artwork I've ever seen. That is my holy grail original art page. I own a lot of Velluto art and Almond art from the Black Panther series. And I read an interview with Christopher Priest where he talked about how Velluto is one of those rare artists where he could just say, okay, I want this, and he was never disappointed what Velluto came back with in terms of what he added to a page and so forth. Just a master artist and someone who I think deserves a lot more recognition for his work.
I'm still reading that first volume of Black Panther. I'm going to get through it, I swear. But from what I've seen of the artwork, I totally echo your sentiments there, Chris. It's some of the most down to earth, like street level art that I've seen that isn't quite of the same vein as like of say like the creators who've worked on some of the Marvel stuff of late, like for Jessica Jones and Daredevil and stuff like that. But this is definitely an art style that worked very, very well for the story that Chris Priest was telling.
Well, he captured, like you said, urban environments, the glory and the grandeur of Wakanda. That series encompassed, as I've said many times, ad nauseum, has encompassed every corner of the Marvel universe, and Velluto captured the feel of all those different aspects of that world. It's many countries and environments and cultures and so forth. Tremendous achievement. All right, should we go to our number threes, gentlemen?
Yep. Time for another go round now. Let's not make Ian go first this time.
All right, Murray, you can go first.
All right, let's rotate here. My number 3 is Eric Shanower.
My number 3, again, no surprise, is Christopher Priest.
I'm surprised he's not number 1.
You'll see why he's not.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And my number 3 is Mr. Chuck Dixon.
Excellent.
Oh. Go ahead, Murd.
All right. Eric Shanower is, he's the only artist I have on my list of top 5s, and, I think about half of his published output has been, not only drawn, but written by him, so it's kind of like all writers for me, after all. So he's not one of those, he's not one of the better-known creators out there, but his artwork is just deluxe. I just adore it, but he's one of those guys who's kind of slow and meticulous and prefers to work to his own pace. His creator-owned image series, Age of Bronze, which it tells the story of the Trojan War. It's been coming out very, very gradually over the past 10 or so years, I think. It's worth the wait, I think, but it hasn't helped his recognizability. He's done other things, of course. He did. As a writer, he wrote all of the Oz adaptations that Marvel Comics published over the last few years, with art by Scotty Young. He also wrote the Little Nemo and Slumberland miniseries that IDW put out not too long ago. Now, those were both delightful. My favorite work of his, and the thing that kind of earned him my devotion, is the series of Oz original graphic novels. Not adaptations of books that other people wrote. These are original stories of his that he both wrote and illustrated. Fully, not just prose stories with illustration. These were comic book stories set in the marvelous land of Oz, using all the original characters, fully drawn by him, lushly full-colored. These were put out by First Comics in the late 80s. I have gushed about these things multiple times. They've been collected by IDW most recently in a full-sized trade paperback collection. I think Shanor did 5 of them. The trade paperback is called Adventures in Oz. It was released in 2006, and I was one of the first people in the country, I like to brag, to have a copy of that. Because I was CGS went to San Diego that year, and on previews night, Wednesday, I went to see Eric Shanor and bought a copy from his Hungry Tiger Press booth. And it's got a pride of place on my bookshelf to this day. Some of my very favorite comics ever made. It combines 2 of my great loves, comics and Oz stories.
Nice.
He's done other things over the years, of course, Shanor has. He's not that much in the way of mainstream work, but I think there was a Zatanna comic that he at least did covers for. He did a few issues of Nexus. There was one issue of Secret Origins, I think, somewhere along the way. But yeah, he's because he has a hard time keeping to a regular schedule, or just chooses not to keep to a regular schedule. I don't really know which. That hasn't exactly helped his visibility. But his work, if you seek it out, I think you will agree with me, is worth the effort it takes to find it. So I have to extend to him a place on my top 5 of underappreciated talents.
Sounds good
right.
here.
Ian, fire away.
I thought you were number 2.
Oh, was I number 2?
Mm-hmm. Yep. No,
I'm sorry.
We're rotating.
All right. Christopher Priest. Now, again, longtime listeners have heard me gush about this creator. Again, ad infinitum or ad nauseum, depending on how you look at it. So I won't say too much more here, only that besides his run on Black Panther, which I consider, besides Don McGregor's Jungle Action, the definitive take on the character, and we saw a lot of Priest's interpretation of Black Panther in the Captain America Civil War film, and I have no doubt we'll see both that and McGregor's take, because I think they're both foundational to the character besides Lee and Kirby, in the forthcoming Black Panther, which I believe comes out, I want to say, in 2018.
Yes.
If I remember, thank you, sir, if I remember correctly. But whether it's Black Panther, his work on Deadpool, his current work on the DC Rebirth Deathstroke series, various random one-shot stories he's written over the years, I've yet to encounter a comic book writer with such a firm command of politics, of geopolitical issues, of the history of the characters the university is dealing with, and who among all that can suffuse humor in everything he's doing as well. This is a writer who can take very heady, serious subjects and then find both the absurdity, the pathos, the humor in all of it as well. I've mentioned many times about the Everett K. Ross character, who just got a glimpse of, played by Martin Freeman in Civil War, and I hope, because that actor is an ideal choice, I hope they really realize the full potential of that character in the Black Panther film. But Ross is a perfect example of creating just such a singular, unique narrative device and using that to really bring the reader in and educate them about the whole world of a character as, frankly, as complex as the Black Panther is. And there aren't a lot of writers who could pull off what Priest did, because, again, he took a character who was very much, in terms of the Black Panther, very much a background character in many ways, and he even referred to himself as that. Like Priest would always say, he was the guy in the back of the Avengers class photo, basically, and he made him one of the most compelling and important characters in the Marvel Universe. And subsequent creators, with mixed success, I'm enjoying the Ta-Nehisi Coates version right now, have really taken that interpretation and pursued different directions with it. But again, Priest, just such an intelligent writer and a writer who really appreciates wit and sarcasm and using it in ways that can both entertain and also enlighten and even make people feel uncomfortable. And I mean that in the best possible way. And in fact, just this past summer, I finally read, Merge will appreciate this, and I'm sure Ian will too, actually, the Falcon miniseries he wrote back in the 1980s.
Oh, when he was still James Owsley.
When he was James Owsley, right? And thoroughly entertaining, serviceable story. You could see the seeds for the greatness that was going to come down the road. And I also want to mention the first story I read by him when he was James Owsley was the still, I consider, outstanding Spider-Man versus Wolverine one-shot from the late 1980s where Wolverine and Spider-Man end up in East Germany. So this is before even the wall collapsed. And they end up involved in espionage. And there you really get a sense of Priest and how he approaches that type of story. And I was middle school when I read it. But it really struck me like, wow, this is not like the typical Marvel comic I usually read, because there was a complexity to it. There was an understanding, even at that age I could sort of grasp, of geopolitical issues. And it was also a story that dealt with the ramifications of Spider-Man in combat being forced to kill somebody and how that affected him. And in contrast to how Wolverine dealt with such similar issues. And for me, that was an early example of what this writer was capable of. When Black Panther came out first under Marvel Knights imprint at the very turn of the century, and I realized, oh wait, James Owens and Christopher Priest are the same person. And considering how much I love that Spider-Man vs. Wolverine one-shot, that got me all that much more excited about reading that Black Panther series. And as I've mentioned many times in there, that is my favorite finite comic book series of all time. And I'm really excited to see how they continue to realize the Panther on the big screen. Thanks so much to the work of people like McGregor and Christopher Priest and their collaborators. So I'm very excited that he's writing Deathstroke now. I'm enjoying that series. It's just because he's also a minister, I believe, as well. And it's nice to see him back in comics, because he wasn't writing comics for quite some time. And I think he's a vitally important writer. I think he's one of the best writers in the business, frankly. And I hope as a consequence of the Black Panther getting so much more of visibility because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that his work gets more attention.
Did he write that Falcon and Captain America series that Bart Sears did the art on in the 2000s?
Which is excellent, especially the ones that are drawn by Joe Bennett.
Yes.
Who Priest has collaborated with other times. That's also a really entertaining series. Because again, he really captures – Priest really addresses racial dynamics very well. I don't mean that in a strident way, just that one of the things that's so great about the Black Panther series is that he brought in racial humor that other writers might have been criticized for, but he did it in such a way that it was both entertaining and edifying. And you saw that in the Captain America and Falcon miniseries as well. And he has a voice that just can really I think touches upon the zeitgeist of the time. So to me, he's one of the best in the business.
And to bring it back around for a minute, if not for Fabian Nicieza, he would have never written Quantum and Woody. So there you go.
Oh God, I forgot to mention Quantum and Woody.
I would have, Chris. Don't worry.
All right, I'm taking out my knife to commit ritual seppuku. No, because you know what? I started reading Quantum and Woody because I had the omnibus.
Mm-hmm. I've been pushing it on you for years. Yes,
and I started this summer, and I'm slowly working through it, and it's thoroughly entertaining. It's him working with his longtime collaborator, Mark Bright, and again, you see that humor, and I think the humor becomes more sophisticated and refined when we get to the Black Panther, but thoroughly entertaining. And again, Priest is a writer who takes iconic characters, iconic concepts. He doesn't disrespect them as a less talented writer would, because they just can't think of how to, assimilate all the history. He takes all the history, he recognizes it, he acknowledges it, he respects it, but then he does something new with it without diluting it, which is, for me, is a highly skilled writer.
He does just the opposite. He concentrates it.
Yeah. So that's my full-throated choice for number 3.
Yep. Find what it is, too, Chris. You got to get through that Quantum and Woody omnibus at some point. Because the humor evolves there, too. And also what you mentioned, his take on racial tensions, that's pretty clearly on display. It's done in rather broader strokes than in Black Panther and elsewhere, of course, but it's on display there, too. And I'll even go so far as to say that the first time I knew about his work was when he was writing things for DC. Like he did The Ray and Justice League Task Force. Not quite as sophisticated as some of the stuff he did later on. He hadn't started to experiment with story structure quite as much. Quantum and Woody is where those sort of black and white title cards at the beginning of every chapter, which is what he's done in almost everything he's written since. But that's, I think, the first time he tried that was Quantum and Woody. Oh, and a bit of fun fan trivia for you here, Chris. Do you know what nom de plume Priest almost chose when he was planning to doff the name Jim Owsley and become something else? Instead of Christopher Priest, he had something else in mind. One of his fellow former editors talked him out of it. Do you know what name he nearly went with?
I do not. Sir, I do not.
Archimedes Thorn.
Ooh. Wow. That certainly rolls off the tongue.
Fantastic.
Yep, I got that out of the letters column of one of his old DC series. So it's
Wow.
I'm not really...
Now that, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me, Murd, for cutting off there. That, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the innumerable examples of why Murd is the Murd and why we value his archivist touch on this show.
That's right.
Haven't you heard? Murd is the word.
That's what I inferred. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Bravo, sir. Bravo. Ian, fire away, sir.
Well, going off of Devin Grayson, I figured that an excellent pick would be Mr. Chuck Dixon, because you want to talk about DC Comics in the 90s and early 2000s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Huh. That was Chuck Dixon. I mean, he wrote everything. I mean, he wrote Batman. He wrote over 100 issues of the Robin series. He started the Nightwing series with Nightwing and Bloodhaven. He was writing the Connor Hawke version of Green Arrow, which I adore to this day. One of the most underappreciated crossovers between the titles that he was writing, the Brotherhood of the Fist crossover between all the titles he was writing at the time. I think it was a 5 or 6 part crossover between Nightwing, Robin, Green Arrow, I think Detective, and maybe one other series was absolutely superb, and it was a great way of stretching the DC universe, like bringing everything together, letting people know that these are all happening at the same place, and all being written by the same person. So go figure. And yeah, like he brought new life into so many characters. When he was writing the Outsiders for a while, under I believe the Batman and the Outsiders title, he was doing a very, very good job there. And like I said with Devin Grayson, Chuck Dixon is another one of those guys who fell out of favor due to a change in the editorial side. And I know that it's at least partially because of his actual real life politics. Because I know he's a much more conservative fellow than a lot of his coworkers, and he might have had foot and mouth disease a little bit at times, saying things he shouldn't have, and it's why you don't see his name on nearly as many titles today as you once did. But I'll also bring to light that we would not have the Birds of Prey without Mr. Right. Chuck Dixon. And although people immediately go to Gail Simone as the definitive Birds of Prey writer, a lot of that groundwork was laid by Chuck Dixon. And I'm glad to see those early Birds of Prey issues are finally being traded. Because for a while, I mean, Chris, you can definitely reiterate this. For a while there, they were basically putting Gail Simone's Birds of Prey as Volume 1.
Yes.
And now they're writing that ship and remembering that there were over 100 issues before Gail Simone came on the Birds of Prey bandwagon.
Well, not quite that many. I mean,
okay, maybe a little less than that.
Yeah, I picked. Yeah, actually, at the latest Wild Pig sale, I picked up her first issue, and it was number 56.
There you go. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was getting my Robins and my Birds of Prey crossed. But yeah, definitely like one of those perennial writers that even people today might not even know of because of the fact that he's just really fallen off the radar. But go back and find yourself some Chuck Dixon stuff, and you're guaranteed to find some of the best work of that time. And a issue in the Amalgam series is Bruce Wayne Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, was one of the better Amalgam titles of the time. So Chuck Dixon.
So he wrote that classic Birds of Prey issue where, is it issue 8, where Dick and Barbara go to the circus and they go on the trapeze.
Yep.
You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the rare, highly sought modern back issues. I've only owned it as a retailer maybe twice. It's very difficult to find. Ian, I want to echo your sentence. I don't pretend to know anything about his politics.
Yeah.
But as a writer, again, kind of like what I said with Bill Manto, very consistent, right?
Yes.
Whenever I read his books, and I remember reading it like he did a new version of Richard Dragon, Kung Fu Fighter, which I enjoyed. I mean, he a very solid writer, very steady writer. I remember I think he did an alternative history war comic called Storming Paradise, where it turns out there is no atomic bomb. The United States actually has to invade Japan. which, Operation Olympic, which was supposed to be the original invasion of Japan at the atomic bombs, had not been employed, and that was thoroughly well done. And I really enjoyed his work with Scott McDaniel on Nightwing. They did that for quite a while, and he's doing some work now, isn't he? I feel like I've seen his name recently.
Yeah, he's still around. I mean, you'll still see his name occasionally, but just obviously not nearly as prevalent as he once was. It was issue 8 of Birds of Prey, by the way, and that was a pre-light boxing Greg Land who drew that issue. But yeah, his name is definitely still around. He's still writing comics. It's just again way less than his previous. I see here he wrote Batman Arkham Killer Croc somewhat recently, or at least sorry that's a re-release. So forget it. Yeah, so I'll find something.
Yeah, he did something with DC in the New 52 era, but as you said, Ian, very soon after that, for reasons political or otherwise, he actually made a public announcement that, owing to irreconcilable differences of some kind with DC's powers that be, he said rather acrimoniously that he was not going to be doing any more work for DC in the near future.
Right. Yeah.
And thus took his exit from mainstream comics entirely.
I found an actual one he's done recently. Apparently, Revolution Road to Revolution,
for IDW,
which is IDW. He worked on that with a bunch of other writers as part of a 100-page special, and that was this year. So, in fact,
actually,
it was last month.
One of our forthcoming off the racks, we're going to be reviewing one of those books, the one involving one of Shane's favorite properties, Mask.
Ah, nice.
So.
You may be interested,
right,
Chris, to know that...
go ahead.
I've got a few things to say here about Chuck.
Please.
Some of his earliest work was for Eclipse, writing the Airboy series, Chris, which obviously isn't the James Robinson series of which you're so fond, but it's the same character, technically. He's one of those guys that straddles genres and seems to be just as much at home writing things like war as he does superheroes or crime fighting. But to me, he is like the king of action comics, and not capital A, capital C, but just comics featuring an action-based story. He does pacing better than almost any other comic book writer I can think of. I introduced some years ago the concept of narrative viscosity, which is just like the flow of a story. How you start reading it, and before you know it, you're turning pages, and the comic is over and done with. It's a quick read, but in the best possible way. And Chuck Dixon was a master at pacing his scripts in that way. He wrote really sharp dialogue. He had a pretty good grasp of the characters with which he was working. He's just a go-to writer, and I'm very glad you brought him up, Ian, because he's very close to the top of my list of alternates.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Murd, you've got a trademark narrative viscosity, by the way.
I can hear it in the tone of one of those car commercials too, like with one of those voiceovers.
14 cylinder.
All right, let's go on to our number 2s, gentlemen, shall we?
All right, Chris, how about you go first?
I'll go first. My number 2 choice is Marie Severin.
Ooh. All right, my number 2, and here's where it gets difficult, where I decide if I'm going alternates or I go main. Why not? I'm going to go with Mr. Adam Warren.
All right, very cool. And I'm going with Tom Peyer.
Ugh. All right, so you were. I could see you guys were a little surprised I didn't make Priest my number 1. I was considering it, but I wanted to save my number 2 and number 1 slots for iconic creators who I think were very instrumental at the beginnings of the comic book medium, certainly the Silver Age. And Marie Severin, who passed away relatively recently, and with her brother John, who's also another tremendous artist. This is someone who was at the very beginning of the Marvel Age of Comics, the Marvel Universe. One of the few female creators working in comics in the 1960s, and she was a multiple threat. She penciled, she colored, she inked, she did production. You can see her work all over Marvel Comics in the 1960s forward. She did runs on the Submariner series. She did runs when they gave Doctor Strange his own title, when they took away the Strange Tales masthead and gave it to Doctor Strange. She did work with the Hulk. And that's just the ones off the top of my head. Tomorrow did a wonderful book, a retrospective of her whole career, which came out not too long ago. I have it. It's fantastic, as all things Two Mars produces. And she was also very much known for her sense of humor. In the Marvel bullpen, a lot of times there'd be satirical drawings floating around of different creators. And she would just – and they've reproduced some of these in Two Mars publications, like Alter Ego, for example. And you can just see how she just had that ability to just capture the essence of a person in just a few lines, essentially. There's a quote I read where the late, great Gil Kane was commenting on a character she did of him, and all he said was, "She leaves me with no illusions." And so her sense of humor, her ability to produce so much on so many different facets of comic book production, and she's just a very important person. When you talk about like the early Marvel age, when it was just that little office and then just a couple of people in there, she was one of the people in there. And alongside John Romita Sr. and Stan Lee and Roy Thomas and Flo Steinberg, the secretary. These are the foundational, iconic people who really brought Marvel to life in the 1960s, and Marie Severin is all over that. And also just acknowledging the fact that she's one of the few women who are working in comics at that time. Just on top of that, how talented she was. And she deserves so much more recognition. Whenever you read interviews with creators like Roy Thomas or Neuer, they have nothing but praise to say about her work and her personality, just who she was as a person. And I could go on and on about her, but just a vitally important creator who really helped get Marvel Comics to where it is today. That's my number 2.
I think I may have some good news for you, Chris.
Please.
I don't believe Marie Severin's dead yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at the very least.
Oh, geez. Now I feel terrible. Okay. No, you're right. You know what? I confused it with her brother. Her brother passed away. You're right, Mert. I apologize. Oh, I feel awful. Well, I'm glad that she's still with us then.
Yes, absolutely. Just don't feel awful about that. Feel glad that she's not dead.
Yep. 87 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep.
I think she had I think she may have had a stroke.
It was in 2007. Yeah. I found record of that, but she recovered.
Yeah. Marie, my apologies. I'm glad you're still with us. Vitally important creator.
Yep. And I echo your what you said about her versatility, the different kinds of styles in which she could work. Because the one piece of her work that I know best and love best is the Star Comics Fraggle Rock series.
Yes.
And she was able to reproduce that Michael K. Frith, Henson Company sense of design very well on the printed page. And she did that just as ably as she did anything else she did for Marvel or elsewhere. So, yes, she's actually on my list of alternates as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Ian, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, unfortunately, I wish I was more familiar with Marie Severin's work than you guys are. Another one of those creators I'm going to have to, get myself more familiar with. I'm sure I've seen the art. It's just I don't think I've read a lot of what she's done. Yeah.
And again, the best way to start with that is get the Tomorrow's book.
Gotcha.
It's outstanding. And Mert, I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm having a terrible brain fart. What's the name of the classic Marvel Silver Age satirical comic?
Not Brand Eck?
Not Brand Eck. I'm pretty sure she contributed work to that too.
She did,
like Irving Forbush, because that was so much. She was so well known for her ability to satirize through her penciling. So that's another example of just again her versatility, as you put it, Mert.
Yeah, her Wikipedia page actually has the cover for Not Brand Eck number 10 right there.
Ah, fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, so that's my number 2.
Okay. My number 2 is Mr. Adam Warren. Now, the reason that I have him on here is he's another one of those creators similar to the Lunar Brothers that hasn't done a lot of work, but what he has done has all been fantastic. One of my all-time favorite Elseworlds of all time is Titan Scissor Paper Stone.
I remember that.
Yep, and it is a one-shot that came out in sort of I guess not quite a hardbound, but it's definitely an oversized book. Like I have it sitting on my shelf because it fits in there with the trades, but it's nice and skinny. And this was a Titan story that was taking place in the far-flung future with these kids who are trying to emulate past heroes. One of them winds up with a neural implant of who he believes is Dick Grayson, and it turns out to be someone else. I think you can probably guess who if it's not Dick Grayson. And yeah, like the artwork itself is incredibly manga inspired, as is the case with a lot of Adam Warren stuff. And as a fan of manga, obviously he falls in lines with my tastes. He did another series. He did one for Marvel called Live Wires, which was one of the ones that they released in the manga format. Sort of like a much smaller trade paperback in a manga style. The way they were doing Spider-Girl for a while and a couple other books.
Was that part of the Tsunami? I'm sorry to interrupt, Ian, but was that part of the Tsunami line that also included like the Human Torch series from Scotty Young?
I think it might have, yeah. If not, it was around that time. But I think it might have been under that Tsunami branch, right. Yeah. But it's weird, too, because these Livewires characters have not shown up once since they were introduced. Yeah, and they're all synthoids. Like they're all like robot characters. You could do so much with that concept if you really wanted to, and they haven't done anything since that. And I still see the Livewires trade, at like libraries and occasionally on the shelf of like a Barnes and Noble, sitting there probably from its first frickin' iteration. And I'd recommend people check that out. Obviously, he's most well known for his Empowered series, which has been coming out for years now, and I believe is just starting up now again after a couple of year hiatus. But both writing and art, I've always been a huge fan of Adam Warren. I know he did some of the translation for the Dirty Pair manga, if I remember correctly, and wrote that, as well as some original stuff for Dirty Pair. But yeah, just one of those artist that manages to get the best of a Japanese style and the best of an American style and meshes them together into one cohesive unit. And I'd like to see more of them.
All right. Bird?
Oh, okay. Yes, it's my turn now. Okay, yeah. So number 2 for me. This is actually the first guy I usually think of when someone asks me what's an underrated creator whose work you'd like to recommend to me. This is just kind of my go-to when somebody asks me that question, and it is Mr. Tom Peyer. In a way, I kind of wish Shane were here at this point, because this is when Shane asked us the other day. It turned out Shane couldn't join us for this episode in the end, but he asked us a few days ago what some examples of our idea of underappreciated creators would be, and Tom Peyer's the one I cited to him. And I know he would agree, because one of the things that he's known for, the Our Man comic book series, which spun out of the DC 1 Million event, that's one of Shane's favorite underrated series, and also one of mine. It's pretty much at the top of my list of underrated series of the past 15 or 20 or so years. So Tom Peyer, he was more of a Vertigo guy originally. He had been an editor for a time, and he crossed over into writing for various Vertigo series in the early 90s for DC. And then from there, he sort of transitioned over to writing more DC Universe material. Became a little more mainstream, but he took that sort of alternative edge and bite of a Vertigo writer with him to his mainstream work. And even though he engaged very well with DC Comics lore and history, which is one of what I love most about him, he never quite lost that edge, and he didn't shy away from taking bold and occasionally even uncomplimentary takes on well-beloved DC characters and concepts. He didn't write that many stories involving actual Justice Society members, although as Our Man, the android Our Man was a legacy bearer for the original Golden Age Our Man, Rex Tyler of the Justice Society. He did give us a few glimpses in that series into Rex Tyler's background and childhood, showed what a crappy childhood he actually had, and basically portrayed him as a drug-abusing asshole. So he didn't shy away from tipping a few sacred cows when it came to the Justice Society. And there's one particular story he did for one of those, Secret Files and Origins one-shots or 80-page giants that DC was doing late 90s, early 2000s quite a bit. And it involved, it was like a dinner party that the whole JSA was attending, and it dug into the class divisions among the members of the Justice Society. Between the wealthy playboys and radio station owners on one side, and the scrappy little prize fighters and college dropouts on the other. Which JSAer sat at which table at this event. And it was kind of an interesting character study, a group character study, and it's one that not that many other writers would have taken on. He also did something called DC 2000, which is kind of a riff on the DC 1 million thing. Where,
Love that.
Yeah. Yep. You remember that miniseries, Ian?
I sure do. It's sitting on my shelf.
Awesome. Yeah, so it's for those of you who don't know, though, it involves the JLA going back in time and encountering the JSA in the 40s, much the same way that the JLA of the far future came back to encounter present-day JLA in the DC 1 million series. And, the JSAers and the JLAers do not get along very well at all. And so it's more of Tom Pyre taking kind of the inkling of an idea that James Robinson had provided for when he portrayed Ted Knight as having had problems with mental illness in the Golden Age miniseries and also in the Starman ongoing series. Tom Pyre sort of applied that to a few other JSAers as well. And so he's told some of my favorite stories with the JSA, despite the fact that there were so few of them. And that's not the only project of his that he's had his fingers on that I really enjoyed. He's also, and this may be a little more controversial for some people listening, he was one of the architects of the Legion of Superheroes reboot, post-Zero Hour. Sometimes known as the Archie Legion, but not to me. To me, that is actually my Legion. Okay, that is when I actually gave the Legion of Superheroes a chance, because by the early 90s, Legion continuity was so badly screwed up that even I, and I'm pretty game when it comes to wading into continuity cesspools, even I would not touch that with a 10-foot flight ring, let me tell you. So the Zero Hour reboot, which was masterminded by Tom Pyre and his co-writer, plotter, and colorist Tom McCraw, was what gave me the opportunity to jump into the Legion and appreciate it, and eventually reach out to read some of the quality Legion or at least learn about some of the quality Legion stories of decades past. So that was my in to the Legion, and I'll be forever indebted to Toms Pyre and McCraw for having written that stage of the Legion's evolution. And again, I appreciated the light tone that they put on it, and I will never, ever, ever insult it or denigrate it by calling it the Archie Legion. So that's something else of Tom Pyre's that I think is worthy of note. So he's been more or less absent from the big two for much of the last several decades. I mean, he came back to DC for the Convergence event, one of several creators from past times who was thrown a little bit of work as a part of that event. He wrote the Convergence Atom 2-issue miniseries. I was glad to see that. He's gotten some make work in Marvel events over the past decade or so. He's a friend of Mark Waid's. The two of them have collaborated several times over the decades, and most recently they're both at Aftershock right now doing Captain Kidd, which is kind of like a reverse take on the Captain Marvel concept. An adult says a magic word or whatever and turns into a youthful superhero. So I'm happy to see that Tom Pyre's getting his byline out there again. He's also... he did some Simpsons comics along the way, I seem to recall. He did a run of... I think it was him. I think he did a run of Marvel Team-Up in the late 90s, which was, kind of took an interesting take on the team-up concept in that each team-up led to a different team-up. It's kind of the same thing that Mark Waid and George Perez did in their Brave and the Bold series, slightly better remembered, of the mid-2000s. But Tom Pyre did it first in the late 90s. So yeah, he engages, as I said before, very well with a character's history. He understands continuity, but still he retains a little bit of that Vertigo sensibility that makes his stories kind of fresh and mordant and fun to read. And so for me, he's kind of the epitome of an underappreciated writer. And so I'm proud to give him a high ranking in my top 5.
I had no idea until I looked it up now that he wrote, looks like 4 or 5 issues of The Authority as well in between runs.
Yeah, I think he even followed up Garth Ennis on The Punisher. I remember he did an arc of that. It was pretty panned. It was called The Medallion, and I think it involved somebody who killed people in taxis or something. But yeah, his byline shows up in some places you wouldn't expect to find it.
Yeah. I also remember he was writing The Flash when Freddie Williams was drawing it back in the mid-2000s.
Yeah, I hadn't remembered that.
Yep. Cool.
All right. Should we go to our number ones, gentlemen?
I think it is that time.
Okay. All right.
Ian, why don't you go? This is your idea. Why don't you go first, sir?
Sure. Well, I'm going to go with Mr. Dan Curtis Johnson.
Oh, all right.
Murd, go ahead.
I'm going with Mr. continuing the first initial trend here, E. Nelson Bridwell.
Ah, fantastic, Murd. I'm going with the late, great Gene Day.
Oh. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about him, Chris, because I don't know a thing about him.
All right.
Well, Dan Curtis Johnson is the reason that I even thought of this topic in the first place, because he is one of those writers that hasn't done a lot. In fact, his works are like you can count them on maybe like two hands at most. He's done a couple of issues of JLA. I believe the Tower of Babel collection has his number 0 issue in it right after Zero Hour. And he, most importantly, was the writer of the Chase series, which to this day is one of my favorite DC series that I have ever read. It was it came out right around the time of DC 1 Million. In fact, its last issue was a 1 million issue, and it introduced the character of Cameron Chase into the DC lexicon after she was first introduced in an issue of Detective Comics, and then followed up here with her own series. And the pencils on that series were Mr. J.H. Williams. Mm-hmm. And the series itself is sort of along the lines of Gotham Central in the way that it's way more grounded than a lot of the other DC characters or books, where Chase is an investigator who is tasked with looking into different problems that are happening in the DC universe, and also things as simple as trying to find out who is behind the Batman cape and cowl. And there was one issue where she had it down to two people. It was either Alan Scott or Bruce Wayne. And that was fun because she wound up going with Alan Scott as the person. So she's entirely convinced that he's the man behind the Batman identity, and then winds up in a whole bunch of adventures there. And she works with the DEO primarily, so you get to see Bones a lot in her series. Bones is, I think, one of the more unique characters that DC has, sort of their Nick Fury, only he's made entirely out of bones. And I always loved it. It never caught on, though, and that's why after 12 issues, Chase sadly came to an end. In fact, sorry, it wasn't even 12 issues. It was technically 10, because their 10th issue was the 1 million issue. And after that, he took his bags and ran. Like, he really didn't do much else in the comic book medium, I think because he felt like it wasn't working for him, and that makes me very, very sad. I'd love to see what he would do today. Really hasn't done much since, it looks like, 2003, 2004, other than some random, reissues of things that he's done. So, Mr. Dan Curtis Johnson, I miss you. Come back.
Yeah, the New 52 could use a few more books like Chase, I must agree. And
absolutely.
I am with you in my love of that short-lived series, Ian. I do have every issue of it. I enjoyed the explorations of some of the more shadowy, cobwebby corners of the DC universe. I like Chase's reminiscence about her own father, who, if I remember correctly, was part of like a superhero thrill cult of sorts, just like people who dressed up as superheroes and villains and played at fighting each other.
Yep.
Until like one guy, Dr. Trap, took it a little too seriously and killed him. Yeah. A little dark, but yeah, it was kind of the atmosphere that was thrown in there by J.H. Williams' art, and there's kind of an X-Files feel to it, which tapped into the zeitgeist of the late 90s very nicely. Yeah, and I would like to see also more of D. Curtis Johnson in comics, but who knows where he's gotten to since those long ago days.
Yeah, I think he's been writing some novels, if I remember correctly.
It's a good.
So you might be up. Yeah, so you might find him without the pictures behind his writing somewhere. But I'll also point out that he did some of the issues of Sins of Youth, that very fun early 2000s crossover. He did the JLA Junior issue of that. So, yeah. Check it out.
All right, Merge, you're number one.
All right. Yes, this man is one of the titans of DC Universe history. And I've mentioned at odd moments here and there throughout the run of Comic Geek Speak that I consider Mr. E. Nelson Bridwell one of my personal heroes, because he is one of the greatest continuity wonks ever to have lived. I mean, he had his peers, his employers, everybody at DC respected him for this, except possibly Mort Weisinger, who was his...
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. Poor Mr. Bridwell worked under legendary and notorious DC Comics editor Mort Weisinger for many years at the beginning of his career at DC. And Weisinger reportedly heaped verbal abuse on him all the time, as he did just about everybody who worked under him. But since Nelson was his assistant, he bore the brunt of it, but he did it with alacrity. He was not one to complain, apparently. He was a quiet little feller. If you've ever seen a picture of him, he looks a little bit like John Fiedler, who did the voice of Piglet for Winnie the Pooh. That might give you an idea. So he was a long-suffering editorial assistant, but he made himself useful around DC because he had such a great memory for all the little details, the minutiae of different DC comic stories, and he kind of yearned to have it all line up and make sense. You know, he probably did more than any single individual, even Roy Thomas or Julie Schwartz, to generate, fabricate, cobble together, whatever verb you want to use, a continuity for DC Comics, the likes of which Marvel ultimately had from get-go. From the time of the Fantastic Four on. Yeah, he is the one who was able to remember all these obscure facts about characters past, and he's the one who took it upon himself to weave a lot of them together. In particular, the history of Superman was Mr. Bridwell's baby. He's the one who took all the different little stories that have been told about Superman's homeworld of Krypton, wove them together into a more or less coherent timeline history, and created this fictitious culture, geography, history for this planet that is one of the more better realized like fictional realities this side of like Jose Luis Borges. He was very deeply involved in that. He did a series of Bronze Age backup stories called like The Fabulous World of Krypton, in which he even came up with names of different units of measurement for Krypton.
Oh, wow.
That's how into this stuff he was. If you can ever find issues of the World of Krypton miniseries from the 80s, there are back pages there that contain Kryptonian glossaries that he compiled of interesting Kryptonian terminology and units of measurement and so forth. In addition to that, I mean, he was an omnibus of DC. Anytime a writer was curious about the status quo of a particular hero or villain, where he or she was last seen, he was the person to ask about it. But he also did work as a writer, so he not only was able to put DC lore in order, he contributed a significant body to it as well. He's the creator of the aforementioned Inferior Five, and those were his characters. I think he also created the Maniacs, lesser-known Silver Age DC characters. They were a band. They were kind of like a mod 60s musical combo. He did runs of Superman family. I think he wrote Mr. and Mrs. Superman, so Earth 2 Superman stories. For the Superman family title back in the 70s. He wrote a bunch of Captain Marvel, Shazam stories in the 70s. That was one of his favorite characters, next to Superman, probably his very favorite. He wrote some issues of Captain Carrot and his amazing Zoo Crew, helped to develop those characters. He wrote the Super Friends title of the 70s, which is fondly remembered by fans in the know who actually were able to look past the kiddie cartoon show reputation it had and realized what quality storytelling it was. He introduced the Global Guardians there, and among them, the characters that eventually evolved into Fire and Ice of the Justice League. We have E. Nelson Bridwell to thank for them. So he also wrote one of my favorite miniseries, the delightful Oz Wonderland War from the 80s, because in addition to his encyclopedic knowledge of comics, he had a similar mastery of the Oz stories and scripture and Shakespeare. Many of my favorite subjects he was intimately familiar with, and I admire him in many different ways and for the many different roles that he filled at DC. And I just... He's been dead for nearly 30 years now. He passed away in 1987. This summer I was reading my run of Infinity Inc., and I came across a Meanwhile column written by then DC honcho Dick Giordano, eulogizing E. Nelson Bridwell, and he mentioned it. So that was in 1987 that he passed on, and many of the things that I've been saying about him actually came from that column. And so I kind of wish that more people today were aware of just what a contribution he made to DC history, how he's one of the most important historians DC ever had. And for his contributions as writer, editor, editorial assistant, He embodies many of the things that I love most about comics. So let the unsung hero be hereby sung. He is number one on my list of underappreciated creators.
Murd, from the way you describe him, I'd say Mark Waid would probably owe him much of a debt, considering how much Mark Waid was into DC's history and bringing continuity together during his heyday at DC.
There are very few people who could best Mark Waid at a DC trivia contest. One of them was Mark Gruenwald. Another, I don't think they ever met, but I'm positive Bridwell could have accomplished the same thing, and that's really saying something for him.
Yeah,
Murd, I want to compliment you. That was a magnificent testimonial. I'm familiar with Bridwell. I've read a lot about him, not as much as you have, but just to second what you're saying, his contributions, both as a writer and as an archivist, as an historian, they can't be understated. And from everything I've read, he just sounded like he was a nice person. And it irks me to think he was working under that petty tyrant Weisinger for so long. I'm sorry, I've read virtually nothing nice about Ward Meisinger from all the people who have written about interacting with him. Roy Thomas has given some wonderful interviews about the 2 weeks he worked at DC Comics under Ward Weisinger in 1965. But
drove him straight into Marvel's arms.
Yeah, we've all had unpleasant bosses in our time, and it never fails to irk me how people just can't seem to understand. If you treat people working for you well, in many cases, they're going to go even further for you in return. And there just seems to be a certain type of attitude that's drawn to management that either because they just can't or they just don't want to, they just don't seem to grasp that, to me, what is just a common sense, fundamental concept. And to think that Bridwell was being abused, Bridwell, with all of his knowledge, was being abused by that prick is just – it's just stuff like that just gets under my skin.
Chris, immediately what comes to my head is the Simpsons line when Mr. Burns was running the softball league. Mattingly, shave off those sideburns. Like that's...
And then he shaves all the hair off the sides of his head, and Burns is still after him about his sideburns.
Yep.
Bravo, Murd. Bravo.
Speaking from the heart, Chris.
All right. Well, and you certainly did, sir. All right, my number one is also unfortunate creator who has passed on, and passed on very, very young. Gene Day was a Canadian artist, and he died in 1982. He was only 30 or 31 years old. And I was introduced to him probably shortly before he died. As a kid, I was 9 or 10 years old, and my parents, this is pre-comic shop days, so the random spinner racks you run into in convenience stores and whatnot, they bought me a copy of Master of Kung Fu 114. And I remember as a kid, where I was when I got it. I think we were then standing in a hardware store after that. I was reading this book. I'd never seen art like that in my short comic book reading life up to that point, and frankly, since then, I've rarely seen art that strikes me the way his art does. If you look at the Master of Kung Fu run, which I've lauded ad infinitum, ad nauseum on the show, Gene Day took over for the last sort of leg of that, what I consider legendary series, which Marvel, I guess they have a brief licensing window because they're now reprinting rapidly the whole series in a series of omnibuses because it was they lost the license years ago, so it's associated with the Sax Romer characters. But the sense of design, of expressiveness, of combat scenes, of just detail. I mean, his splash pages are some of the most breathtaking art I have ever seen anywhere in a comic book. And I'd say to anyone, it's cheap. Track down a copy of Master of Kung Fu 114 or wait for the omnibus when they reprint that. It's working with the great Doug Munch, and they're adapting a Chinese fable into the world of Shang-Chi. And Murd and I actually talked about this book. We did our Master of Kung Fu Spotlight. But
yes, you gave me a copy of it, actually.
Yes, and I'm not doing it justice. You have to see it to really appreciate how breathtaking this man's talent was and what a tragedy that he died as young as, I want to say he had a heart attack, but don't quote me on that he died as young as he did. Many listeners have seen his work because he did a very famous cover of the original Star Wars series where it's Boba Fett dominates the cover and he's pointing his blaster sort of at the audience, and Princess Leia is in the background, various other characters. I'm failing on the issue number. Damn it! I want to say it's in the 70s numbers of that series. It's one of the covers of one of the Star Wars omnibuses Marvel has produced in recent years. He did a couple issues of that series as well. To me, he is one of the greatest artists who's ever worked in the American he was Canadian, but ever worked in the American comic book medium. And I highly recommend people seek out his work. I'm not doing it justice here. But it has an emotion and a passion, and you can see how much he poured of himself into that work. And he made, for me, Master of Kung Fu in that latter period one of the top Marvel titles of the early 1980s. So Gene Day is my number one choice.
To fill the pants role, that was episode 1575, Marvel Triple Action with Power Man, Iron Fist, and Shang-Chi. You guys did your little mini spotlight.
Thank you.
Funny, you did pants proud. Thank you.
And I think I need to add those omnibuy to my Amazon wish list because that sounds like stuff I would really enjoy.
Oh well. Again, you can go back to our spotlight because I just profusely go on about Master of Kung Fu for a good hour or so. But
yep,
it's a series that I think any student of American comic books and of Marvel as well, you should read it because they took basically the Kung Fu craze of the early 70s because Shang-Chi was created by Englehart and Starlin, and then Munch ran. Munch to me is the definitive Shang-Chi writer. But they took it and they made something else out of it that is, in terms of espionage, in terms of a profound philosophical character study, in terms of mysticism, and just really great kung fu action. Classic series. I wouldn't be surprised if Shang-Chi shows up in the Netflix world at some point. I'm kind of expecting that.
He's going to actually. It's been announced.
Oh, he is.
Yeah,
okay.
he's going to be in the Iron Fist series.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Yep.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, so we do our alternates, gentlemen.
Sure.
You bet.
All right.
Do you just want to kind of do we'll just kind of each of us spout out our list, then just go to the next person, or?
Yeah, might as well.
Yeah, just rapid
Ian,
fire.
Ian, you can go first.
All right. Well, alternates that I haven't mentioned already. Mr. Judd Winnick, one of my favorite writers, who best known for things like Exiles and his run on the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern series, as
Barry
well
Ween?
as Barry Ween and Batman Under the Red Hood is probably what he's most well known for. Bringing Jason Todd back into the fold at the Bat books. But he really hasn't done much in the past couple of years. Ever since New 52, he did one book there, I think Catwoman, if I remember correctly, and he might have started off the Batwing series.
He definitely did, yeah, the one set in Africa.
Yeah, and then that was it from him. I haven't really heard much in recent memory, so would like to see more of him. And those of you who haven't checked out Exiles and specifically his Kyle Rayner stuff, I would give that a check. Sean McKeever is a writer.
Oh,
yep.
Fantastic choice.
Oh yeah, and he's again one of those guys who is more known for smaller titles or for fill-in runs on a whole bunch of books. But he's the co-creator of Gravity with Mr. Mike Norton, the most large teddy bear you'll ever hug. Sentinel was also his series, and Sentinel. That's another one of those books that was part of the Tsunami line, if memory serves.
Very enjoyable series.
Loved it. So much fun with some very, very good art. Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane. Yep. I'm sure that a lot of that stuff is going to wind up in the Spider-Man Homecoming movie, at least style-wise, because that seems to be what they're drawing a lot of that inspiration from. He had a run on Teen Titans as well. Mystique, he took over from Brian K. Vaughan. The Young Allies book was very good, and he doesn't get a lot of love. So,
and if I may jump in for a minute,
sure.
I was introduced to his work back in the late '90s or mid '90s. He did a series called The Waiting Place.
Oh yeah,
there were two iterations of the first one was with the Frame Brothers, and the second one was with Mike Norton. In any medium, with the exception of maybe Freaks and Geeks, the most realistic and perceptive and cutting and touching capturing of American high school life I've ever read, seen anywhere. It's collected in both series are collected in one book. Is it IDW? Damn it, I forgot who did the trade. If you're not too traumatized by your high school memories, you've got to read this book, because when I read this, I was like, wow, this guy's an amazing writer, because he got it. Mm-hmm. And I can't recommend that series enough. Great pick, Ian. Yep. Great pick.
Thank you.
Yep. He kind of made capturing the teenage voice his stock and trade as a writer.
Definitely.
Do it well.
Yeah. I want to see more Gravity in the Marvel Universe, too. I feel like we have not seen enough out of that character. And actually, speaking of Gravity, one of my alternates here is a man who wrote Gravity in the Beyond series. Had to mention him at least at one point during this call, Mr. Dwayne McDuffie. Oh, yeah. Because a man who has done so much, or did so much, unfortunately, he's since passed away, but did so much for both DC and Marvel, and as well as creating Static and the entire Milestone line, but he never really seemed to get his due at the big two.
And he did animated writing as well, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah, the World of Cardboard speech is entirely Dwayne McDuffie out of Justice League. I mean, one of the best moments in that entire series. He worked on Damage Control, Firestorm, Justice League of America, Fantastic Four. One of my most underappreciated Fantastic Four runs was when he was on the book and Storm and Black Panther had joined the team. And that was excellent. Really, really enjoyed that.
I remember that. It was very good, yes.
Yeah.
And let's not forget Milestone Media, too.
Yes, indeed. Yep, definitely. Everything that he did out of Milestone was worth it. And I'll mention in passing an artist that it single-handedly has shaped the current look of the Marvel Universe. And I mention him all the time, and I got to mention him here, Mr. Chris Anka. He is an artist that has a fashion sense like no other. He helped design the current Captain Marvel costume, which everybody loves. He's done redesigns on Wolverine, on the X-Men as a whole, Psylocke, Storm over the years. All of these very kinetic and unique redesigns. And his pencil-wise, he's only really done like a couple of titles here and there. Like he worked on Bendis's Uncanny for a little bit, and I think a little bit of his regular X-Men run. And he's ending a run on Captain Marvel right now that's been very good. But if you have not checked out anything that Chris Anka has done, do so. He's a fantastic artist. Those are my alternates.
All right. Murray, do you mind if I go?
Oh, you go right ahead.
All right. I'll just, following Ian's example, I'll just kind of give brief blurbs here for each. Joe Duffy. I've mentioned her work when we did both our spotlight, which Ian just mentioned, on Power Man and Iron Fist, and also we did our spotlight just shy of a year ago on Star Wars comics to the Marvel era. Her work on both Power Man and Iron Fist in the 80s and the Star Wars comics, especially the post-Return of the Jedi stuff, remains thoroughly entertaining, very intelligently written, a lot of great humor and wit. In the current magnificent Power Man Iron Man series by Walker and Green, they pay tribute to her in one of the early – it might have even been the first issue, one or two, where her name appears on the wall in a restaurant they're in. Just, again, a very solid, reliable writer who has a great voice, who knows how to use humor and to fuse that with pathos and action. Again, she's someone whose back issues should be sought out either in single issues or trades, because consistently strong writer. Highest recommendation. Paul Cornell.
Yes.
His Captain Britain and MI13 run remains another one of my favorite finite Marvel titles.
Yes, indeed.
That's a series that anyone who loves Marvel history or loves Captain Britain, Black Knight, you got to read that book. And if you're a Dracula fan, like Tomb of Dracula, you doubly have to read that book.
Chris, definitely his Wisdom book that came before that also was fantastic.
Which I have not read, actually, but I'm sure it is, because
so
I appreciate that, because Wisdom has a prominent role in Captain Britain MI13, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yep.
I've not read his Black Ring story in Action Comics. I actually have the trade I haven't read. I've heard that's also very good. I don't know if he's writing in comics now. I can't answer that, but
a lot of Doctor Who stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, because he was a writer on the TV show as well.
Oh, all right. I'm glad his career is flourishing then, because again, kind of like Priest, his command of Marvel history in the Captain Britain MI-13 series is so strong. Like the way he used classic characters like Blade, the Black Knight, Spitfire, and just brought in their histories and created these new relationships. It's top flight writing. So that's another series I highly recommend.
He also wrote, wasn't there a Dark X-Men series that he wrote during Dark Reign, if I remember correctly? Because I remember reading that and being very impressed with his take on sort of like the villainous side of the X-Men. Yeah, Dark X-Men, that's what it was. Yeah,
I have not read that.
Very good.
5-issue.
If he wrote it, go ahead, Mert. I'm sorry.
I think it was like a 5-issue miniseries, if I'm remembering correctly. Like a name
you got it right.
I also want to mention Steven Seagal. Now, for me, another one of the all-time among any company, one of the all-time great finite series, Sandman Mystery Theater. Now, that was initiated by Matt Wagner and Guy Davis, who penciled the whole series, essentially. But Siegel came on and then eventually took over for Wagner. He wrote probably the most captivating and true-to-life male-female relationship between Diane Belmont and Wesley Dodds I've ever read in any comic book. And the way he folded in aspects of crime noir and the golden age into that series. DC is now doing larger, like they say, book 1, book 2, which they're doing now with a lot of their Vertigo stuff, of that series. Don't think. Go out and buy them. It is without question one of the best series DC had in the 1990s. And I think it still remains one of their most compelling titles that's available in print. And I think it's a masterwork, and Siegel had a big part to play in that series. And he's done a lot of other work too. I'm well aware that I know that, but that's what I associate him with, is that Sandman Mystery Theater run. Ian, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
No. Go right ahead.
And I also wanted to mention a friend of the show who deserves as much attention as possible. I think was one of the top artists in the business, is J.K. Woodward.
Yes.
Ooh.
Who's I'm proud to say that I have 2 original art pieces, and Ian's pointing at his. Is that Green Lantern?
No, it's actually Invincible.
It's Invincible. Okay, I have one he did of the Golden Age Wesley Dodds Sandman, and one he did of Blade, the Vampire Slayer. Besides being a hell of a nice guy, and one of the and this means a lot to me as a retailer, one of the best guests I've ever had in my store. Because not to be inappropriate or let's just say some artists are difficult to wrangle, and
do go on, sir.
As guests in your store. J.K. always made it easy, and I mean, like the last thing I saw him do that I read was they did Harlan Ellison's version of Star Trek: The City on the Edge of Forever. And don't think of like the boring like lightbox art that Ian was referring to before. Woodward just has the ability to take characters that you're familiar with from other mediums, and it's that character. Like his Mr. Spock was amazing, but he breathes his own life into it, his own signature, and I think he's one of the top artists in the business. He has a great cinematic flair to his storytelling, but it's not that sort of artificial kind of dry, flat style you would relate to like a lightbox type approach. It's J.K. Woodward's work. It's stylized. It's beautiful. His covers are some of the most gorgeous things I've seen in the business in recent years. Yep. He's done work on Fallen Angel with Peter David. I mentioned Star Trek: The Edge of Forever. He's done Doctor Who work. Few artists work as hard as he does at conventions to give to people just first-rate sketches that are more than worth what you're paying for them.
Oh my God! Please.
Yeah.
I got my Invincible. It was right before he realized just how little he was charging, because that is a full black, white, and gray watercolor of Invincible, and I think he charged me $25 for it at a New York Comic Con. And I saw it, and I was like, "Really? That's all I'm paying you? Are you serious, man?" I'm like, take it. And he's one of the most generous, friendly, nice guys you'll ever meet.
Generous to a fault.
Yep, J.K., if you're listening or if someone knows him, please, we miss you because he moved out to California.
Yeah.
And I hope he's flourishing there. Mert and I interviewed him, maybe it was last year, Mert, I think.
Yeah. He's doing well. Pants and I saw him down at Heroes Con. But at that point, he was just about conventioned out, though. He said he just needed to get home, clean his house, and do some painting. That's all he wanted to do.
Well.
And he still podcasts with Daryl Taylor on occasion, so you can hear him there. Yeah.
Well, again, an artist who deserves more work, deserves more recognition, and I recommend him to every comic book enthusiast out there. Now, the last person I'm going to mention isn't so much that this artist is underrated, as I think in terms of the history of the comic book medium is criminally overlooked. And the person I'm referring to, and I've talked about him before, is Don Heck.
I knew that name would come up.
Yeah, and I kind of struggled about whether or not to put him on the top 5, but I mean, a lot of people know the name Don Heck, where maybe they don't know the name Gene Day, for example. But let me tell you, when we talk about, again, the foundation of the Marvel Universe, everybody knows Ditko, everybody knows Lee, everybody knows Kirby. His Don Heck often is kind of like the last name they mention, if they mention him at all. And when we did our Iron Man spotlight on the Silver Age Iron Man spotlight a couple months ago, you know, he's at the core of all of that. I mean, when it comes to Silver Age Avengers and Silver Age Iron Man, Don Heck is very much fundamental to the realization of those characters and those worlds. And it cannot be overstated enough how important he was to the foundation of the Marvel Universe, and also what a deeply talented artist he was. Unfortunately, passed away in the 1990s. But you know, I've read that Two Moors that, again, as I mentioned, did a wonderful retrospective on his career that came out not too long ago. From everything I've read about him, talked to people who had interacted with him, just a humble man, a very kind man, and a man who, I mean, when you think a lot of the great, like, he co-created Hawkeye, he co-created the Black Widow, I mean, and he drew female characters. Few people did it better than he did in the time period with which he was working. And he's an artist who deserves endless praise and recognition for his place in the history of the American comic book medium. Those are my alternates.
Amen to that.
Thank you, sir. Bert, go ahead.
Well, as usual, I've got a kind of a long list here, so a lot of these guys. Couldn't be. No, so I'm just going to name drop a lot of these people. I'm not even going to provide a blurb for some of them. But number one on alternate number one here, very nearly made my top 5 actually, is an artist named Paris Cullins, whose work was seen at DC in the 80s. He drew the Blue Beetle and also the Blue Devil. A couple of blue characters. It's kind of a loose, energetic, slightly cartoony style. It's good for fun series like those two. Blue Devil remains one of my favorite DC 80s series, and nobody's quite gotten the character right since, I think. Nobody makes him fun enough. Let's see, John Ostrander of Suicide Squad fame and many other things as well. Chuck Dixon, as mentioned by Ian. Penciler Carrie Nord, who drew one of the most underrated Daredevil arcs.
Great choice, Merd.
A couple of my favorite Bronze Age Superman writers, Elliot S. Magan and Marty Pasco, both sort of charted the fortunes of the Man of Steel at about the same time. Artist Mike McCone, who I know best from his work on Exiles.
Fantastic.
Artist Mike Manley. He drew my favorite, one of my favorite Bizarro sketches in my portfolio was done by him at a Baltimore convention a bunch of years ago. He also drew a bunch of issues of the Power of Shazam series of the mid-'90s, which I love. A couple of gentlemen who need no introduction, friends of the show also, Jamal Igle and Mike Norton.
Yeah.
Let's see, Peter Tomasi and Tony Bedard, a couple of writers who've the glue that have held the DC universe together over the past few years, doing fill-in arcs or writing unsung series for that company. And Tony Bedard also did a bunch of issues of Exiles, as you know, Ian.
Yes, indeed. And Tomasi has one of my favorite Nightwing runs of all time.
Oh, indeed. Let's see. Artist Ron Lim of the Marvel Infinity fame. Love his stuff. He was the first artist whose style I learned to recognize when I saw it on the page. Now, here are a couple of lesser-known names from the Silver Age. A guy named Leo Rosenbaum, who, under the alias Richard Hughes and a ton of other pseudonyms, he wrote nearly the entire published output of the American Comics Group, publisher that existed in the Silver Age. And he collaborated with an artist named Ogden Whitney, also on this list, to give the world Herbie the Fat Fury.
Yes!
The lollipop-powered powerhouse of pinguidity. Is this
magnificent?
Incredibly apt, since Halloween was only a few days ago.
Say that again?
I said incredibly apt, since Halloween was only a few days ago.
Oh, because of the lollipop connection?
Yeah.
It'll be a cool thing to cosplay, too. Herbie the Fat Fury.
Yeah.
Okay, and another creator of that same generation, one Paul S. Newman, who wrote a ton of stories. For like Dell Gold Key. He, at one time, and probably still does, held the Guinness Book of World Records as most prolific comic book writer. But very few people have, I would imagine, have heard his name. So he wrote some Solar Man of the Atom material. So and that is one of my favorite non-Marvel or DC superheroes ever. So he's in here too. I've got painter Dan Brereton, creator of the Nocturnals. I've got artist Jamie McKelvey of Young Avengers and The Wicked plus The Divine.
Excellent choice. Excellent choice.
No, I'm glad you agree, Ian. His art style is just fantastic. And if you don't know what Eric Shanower's art looks like, McKelvey's is very close to Shanower's. So if you like McKelvey, you'll like Shanower too. And speaking of Shanower, Chris, I thought of something else that he drew. That Prez Smells Like Teen President one-shot.
That's right.
That was him.
Classic murder.
Written by Brubaker. I got Joe Casey.
Nice.
Much underappreciated writer who, for my money, is second only to Grant Morrison as far as writing really mind-bending, high-concept superheroics. He's the one who gave us Automatic Kafka, if I'm not mistaken. Artist Chris Weston of The 12, who draws such just mouth-wateringly gorgeous Golden Age characters and like 1940s period settings. I want him to draw a monthly JSA book or Freedom Fighters or Seven Soldiers of Victory. I'd even take Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, for crying out loud. I just want more.
The 12, the series that took nearly 12 years to finish.
Fitting, isn't it? The marketing writes itself.
Exactly.
And you haven't seen that much of his work in American comics since then either. And I wish he's British, so he tends to stick to like Judge Dredd stuff. But I really wish we could see more of him taking on American, especially Golden Age characters. Then Marie Severin, aforementioned, and for pants, the last name on my list, Pat Olive.
Oh. He came to mind as you were talking, and actually I'd be remiss not to add in Mr. Todd Knock. As an underappreciated creator.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the late, great Ross Andrew, who, for me, is one of the all-time great, amazing Spider-Man artists. He drew the book for about 5 years, 1973, it's about 77, 78, The Mark of the Man-Wolf. And wonderful artist who I thought just so captured the world of Spider-Man so well. Peter Parker, a supporting cast. I talked a lot about him in our Spider-Man spotlight on the Bronze Age, but he should also be noted. Woo!
Excellent.
Wow.
Job well done, gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Ian, great topic idea, my friend.
Yes,
great
thank
topic
you,
idea.
Glad to have done so, and glad this turned out as well as it did.
Yes, and it's on our side. We're just sorry that we didn't do it many moons sooner than we have.
Now, it's like a well-simmered soup. It has to go for a while until.
I think we simmered this thing into a fine vapor, and it's let's just inhale it with gusto.
Then you can put like a towel over your head and just breathe it in.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a Turkish bath of comic goodness.
And that increasingly esoteric note should probably take us out then, Murray.
Oh, sure. And so let's, speaking of esoterica, let's go over to our sponsor and thank Superhero Stuff at their website, superherostuff.com. They have a wide selection of superhero licensed apparel and other goodies that you can buy for yourself or as you begin your Christmas shopping for people you love. Superhero Stuff, where you go for all of your
superhero stuff.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, there's going to be no music in the background as I say this because, as I said, the soundbite file is broken. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so to comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. If you'd like to mail us something, our mailing address is 320 Hendel Street, Shillington, PA 19607. Leave us a voicemail at 267-702-6642. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is Comic Geek Speak, all one word. You can stop by thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com to participate in some fun comics-related discussions. We got a fun little community going there, and I know all of you are just champing at the bit to share your own lists of underappreciated creators. I know this is a topic that's going to spark a lot of participation, so please come to the talkback thread for this episode there, episode 1628, and share your lists at that thread or respond to what we had to say about our own lists. We really encourage that. We'd like to give a thanks to not only our sponsor, superherostuff.com, but to everybody, like private listeners who have donated to the show in the past. We truly appreciate it. Could not do the show without you. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time.
You got it on Wednesday, and you was talking about it, going to the volume up. These guys will talk about it, everything that geeks love. From capes to laser beams, opinions like the sea.